Brazil looks different now? Not louder, not flashier, not even more talented, just more controlled. For decades, the Brazil national football team wasn't feared because they dominated games. They were feared because they could break them. One moment of chaos, one piece of magic, one player turning nothing into everything. That was Brazil. Unpredictable, untouchable, uncontrollable. But this version? They slow the game down. They recycle possession. They hold their shape. They press with structure. They defend with discipline. They look like a system. And that's exactly where the question begins. Because the more Brazil starts to look like everyone else, the more you have to ask, what did they lose to get here? On paper, this might be the most balanced Brazil we've seen in years. A team that can control tempo, manage transitions, and compete tactically with the best in the world. The kind of team built to survive not just moments, but entire tournaments. But football isn't played on paper. And something about this Brazil still feels incomplete. Because control comes at a cost. Structure demands sacrifice. And when you turn chaos into order, you don't just remove mistakes. You might remove the very thing that made you special. So what is this version of Brazil really becoming? A smarter, more complete team ready to dominate the FIFA World Cup 2026? Or a perfectly constructed illusion, one that looks stronger than ever, but quietly lost the one thing no system can replace? Because if you look closer, the results, the performances, even the way they win, they don't always match the story people are trying to tell. And that's where everything starts to unravel. On the surface, everything about this Brazil feels convincing. A new generation of stars entering their prime, a system that finally looks organized, a team that, for the first time in years, seems capable of controlling games instead of just surviving moments. To many fans and analysts, the conclusion feels obvious. This is Brazil evolving, growing up, becoming a serious contender again, and heading into the FIFA World Cup 2026, that narrative is only getting louder. But here's the problem. The deeper you look, the less stable that narrative becomes. Because despite all the talk about control, Brazil still struggles to dominate the games that matter most. They can look composed for long stretches and then suddenly lose rhythm. They can build patiently and then fail to create anything meaningful in the final third. They can defend with structure, but still look vulnerable the moment that structure breaks. It's not obvious, it's not constant, but it's there. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because this isn't a team that looks broken, it's a team that looks almost complete. Just convincing enough to make you believe the problems are gone, when in reality they've just changed form. Even their wins don't always feel dominant. The scoreline might say control. The possession might suggest superiority. But the game itself tells a different story, one where Brazil isn't always dictating, just managing. And in modern football, that difference is everything. So the real question isn't whether Brazil is improving, it's whether they're improving in the right direction. Because if this transformation isn't as solid as it seems, then what we're watching isn't a rise. It's a transition built on fragile ground. And that becomes impossible to ignore. The moment they face a team that doesn't just play the game, but controls it better than they do. It didn't collapse all at once. It started with moments, small ones, easy to ignore. A game where Brazil had the ball, but not the control. A match where they looked organized, but never truly dangerous. Performances that felt fine, until you realized fine was no longer enough. Then came the reminder the world couldn't ignore. At the FIFA World Cup 2022, Brazil had everything they needed to go all the way. Talent, depth, momentum. For long stretches, they looked like the most dangerous team in the tournament. Until they weren't. Against Croatia, one moment changed everything. A game Brazil should have controlled slipped into chaos. Structure disappeared. Emotions took over. And just like that, they were out-eliminated, not because they lacked quality, but because they couldn't manage the game when it mattered most. At the time, it felt like an accident. A single bad night. A cruel twist. Something that wouldn't happen again. But then, it did. In World Cup qualifying, Brazil faced the one team that understood exactly how to expose them, Argentina national football team. And this time, it wasn't close. From the very first minutes, Brazil looked second best. Not outplayed by moments, but outplayed by design. Argentina dictated the tempo, controlled the spaces, and forced Brazil into a game they couldn't handle. The result, a heavy defeat, wasn't just shocking, it was revealing. Because this wasn't about individual mistakes. It wasn't about one bad decision or one unlucky moment. It was something deeper. Brazil didn't lose control. They never had it to begin with. And once that realization settles in, everything starts to look different. Not just the losses, but the wins. Not just the big games, but every game. Because now, the question isn't whether Brazil can play well. It's whether they can control a match when the opponent refuses to let them. And that's where the real problem begins to show itself. If you strip away the emotion and just look at the numbers, the picture becomes even clearer. In that loss to Argentina national football team, Brazil didn't just fall short. They were outplayed in every phase that actually decides a modern football match. Argentina controlled the ball for most of the game, not overwhelmingly, but enough to dictate the tempo, enough to decide when the game sped up and when it slowed down. Brazil, meanwhile, had possession but not authority. They moved the ball, but rarely moved the opponent, and that difference showed up everywhere. Progression into the final third, Argentina did it more, and did it better. They consistently broke lines, found space, and advanced with purpose. Brazil struggled to do the same, often recycling possession without ever turning it into real pressure. Touches inside the box told the same story. Argentina kept finding ways in. Brazil barely got there. Then came the shots. Argentina created chances with structure, multiple attempts, high-quality opportunities, clear attacking patterns. Brazil, on the other hand, produced almost nothing. Few shots, even fewer that actually threatened the goal. And when you look at expected goals, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Argentina's attacking output reflected a team in control. Brazil's numbers reflected a team reacting, not dictating. But the most telling stat wasn't any single number. It was the pattern behind all of them. Because every metric pointed to the same conclusion, Argentina didn't just play better. They controlled the game. And Brazil couldn't stop it. This wasn't about one bad performance. It was a structural issue showing itself in the clearest possible way. A team that looked organized on the surface, but couldn't impose itself when the opponent had a stronger system. And once you see that, it becomes obvious. Brazil's problem isn't what they lack in talent. It's what they lack when the game becomes a battle of control. And this is where the illusion finally breaks. Because for years, the conversation around Brazil has been the same: if they fall short, it must be because of the players. Not enough discipline, not enough focus, too much flair, too much chaos. But that explanation doesn't hold anymore. Not with this generation. Because Brazil today doesn't lack talent. If anything, they have more balance than ever. Players who can press, players who can build, players who can adapt to multiple systems. On paper, this is exactly the kind of squad modern football demands. So if the players are good enough, why does the same problem keep showing up? The answer is uncomfortable. It's not about talent. It's about control. For all the talk of structure, Brazil still struggles in the one area that defines elite teams dictating the rhythm of the game. Their midfield can look solid until it's asked to manage pressure. Their pressing can look coordinated until it's broken once. Their defensive shape can hold until the opponent forces them to think instead of react. And when that happens, the cracks appear. Spaces open up between the lines. The distance between defense and midfield stretches just enough to be exploited. The press arrives a second too late. The recovery runs feel slightly disjointed. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but together, it creates a pattern. A pattern where Brazil is always half a step behind when the game becomes tactical instead of emotional. This is the real shift from the past. There was a time when Brazil didn't need perfect structure. They could survive chaos because they were the best at it. They could turn broken games into moments of brilliance. But modern football doesn't reward chaos anymore. It punishes it. And the old identity, the one built on instinct and individual magic, no longer guarantees control against teams that are drilled, disciplined, and tactically precise. So Brazil tried to evolve. They tried to become more structured, more controlled, more European in their approach. But here's the problem. You don't just add control overnight. You have to build it. And until that foundation is truly solid, what you get isn't a complete transformation. It's something in between. A team that looks structured, but doesn't fully trust its structure. A team that wants control, but doesn't always know how to keep it. And that's exactly why the next change was so important. Because Brazil didn't just need better players. They needed someone who understood how to turn a group of talent into a system that could actually control games. That change came in a way Brazil had never truly embraced before. For the first time in their history, they turned outward not to a player, not to a symbol of their past, but to a different philosophy entirely. They brought in Carlo Ancelotti, and that decision alone told you everything. Because Ancelotti doesn't represent flair, he doesn't represent chaos, he doesn't rely on moments. He represents control. Across Europe, he built his reputation not by forcing one system, but by mastering all of them. At every club, with every generation of players, knowing when to accelerate, when to slow down, when to adapt, and when to impose. That's exactly what Brazil lacked. Not ideas, not talent, clarity. Clarity in roles, clarity in structure, clarity in how to manage a game when it doesn't go their way. And that's what Ancelotti brings. Early signs of his influence are subtle but undeniable. Brazil no longer looks rushed in possession. The spacing between lines is tighter. The team doesn't break apart the moment they lose the ball. Instead of reacting, they're starting to anticipate. But more importantly, the mentality is shifting. Under Ancelotti, no one is untouchable. Reputation doesn't guarantee a place. Every player has a role, and every role has responsibility. That creates something Brazil hasn't consistently had in years. Accountability, and accountability changes everything. Because once players stop relying on individual moments, they start trusting the system. And when that happens, the game slows down, not physically, but mentally. Decisions become clearer. Movements become more synchronized. The team starts to function as one unit instead of 11 individuals. But this is where it gets interesting, because Ancelotti isn't here to erase Brazil's identity. He's here to reshape it, to take that natural creativity and place it inside a structure that can survive at the highest level. And if he gets that balance right, Brazil doesn't just improve. They become something far more dangerous than before. Not a team that needs chaos to win, but a team that can control it. Now, for the first time in years, you can actually see what Brazil is trying to become. Not just in moments, but in structure. Under Carlo Ancelotti, Brazil no longer approaches games with a single identity. They adapt. They shift between systems. Sometimes it's a 4-3-3 built on width and control. Other times, it becomes a 4-2-3-1 designed to stabilize the midfield and protect transitions. But the formation isn't the real change. The control is. In possession, Brazil is starting to look patient. They recycle the ball instead of forcing plays. The midfield drops deeper to build, creating clearer passing lanes and reducing the risk of turnover. Instead of relying on individual dribbles to break lines, they move the opponent first, pulling defenses out of shape before attacking the space. And that changes everything. Because now, when Brazil attacks, it feels intentional. Off the ball, the difference is even more noticeable. The pressing is no longer chaotic. It's coordinated. Triggers are clearer. When one player steps, the rest follow. The distances between lines stay compact, making it harder for opponents to find space in between. Defensively, they don't just react anymore. They control space. And that's the biggest shift of all. Because the best teams in the world don't just defend goals, they defend zones, angles, and tempo. That's what made teams like Argentina national football teams so effective. That's what allowed France national football team to balance discipline with explosiveness. Brazil is starting to move in that direction. A midfield that doesn't just chase but dictates. A defensive line that doesn't panic but holds shape. A system that doesn't collapse under pressure but absorbs it. On paper, this is the most complete Brazil in years. A team that can press high, sit deep, control possession, and transition quickly. A team that doesn't depend on one style but can switch depending on the opponent. And that versatility is what wins tournaments. But here's the question that still lingers. Because evolution always comes with a trade-off. The more structured Brazil becomes, the more they move away from the chaos that once made them unstoppable. And in the biggest moments, when games aren't decided by systems but by instinct, will this version of Brazil still have that edge? Or have they traded unpredictability for control without fully mastering either? So now we arrive at the real question. Not whether Brazil is improving, but what they are becoming, because everything we've seen points in two directions at once. On one side, this is the most organized Brazil in years. A team that understands space, manages tempo, and no longer depends entirely on moments of brilliance. Under Carlo Ancelotti, they are learning how to control games, not just react to them. They look calmer, smarter, and far more prepared for the demands of a tournament like the FIFA World Cup 2026. And that matters. Because modern football doesn't reward chaos the way it once did. It rewards teams that can adapt. Teams that can suffer without losing structure. Teams that can win in different ways across multiple games in a short period of time. In that sense, Brazil is finally evolving. But on the other side, there's something missing. That edge, that unpredictability, that feeling that at any moment, one player could change everything without warning. The kind of chaos that no system can prepare for and no opponent can fully control. Because structure creates consistency, but it can also limit freedom. And the greatest versions of Brazil never chose one over the other. They mastered both. That's the balance this team is still chasing. Not just control, but controlled chaos. Not just discipline, but freedom within it. And until that balance is truly complete, this Brazil will remain a question, not an answer. So heading into 2026, the narrative is simple, but the truth isn't. Is this the most complete Brazil we've seen in decades? Or a team that looks stronger than ever, while quietly losing what made them special? Because when the biggest moments arrive, when the pressure peaks, when systems start to break, that's when we'll finally find out what this Brazil really is. And the answer might be very different from what everyone expects.